Even elimination against Brazil at the World Cup won't be enough to stop the celebrating. Not only has Mexico elected its first left-wing president in decades, it's also on track to hand Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador an outright majority in Congress. But can Amlo deliver? We'll be asking whether the 64-year-old's a radical or a reformer, and see how the firebrand former mayor of Mexico City can or cannot make good on his promise to tackle corruption, violence, fight for the poor. On that score, he shares with Donald Trump the distaste for the North American Free Trade Agreement, where cheap imports of U.S. food have undercut Mexican farmers. And even though AMLO has vowed to stand up to Trump on immigration, it's fair to ask whether the pair just might agree to end NAFTA as we know it. Most pressing, though, will be the violence after an election campaign where more than 130 politicians were killed, violence that illustrates the power of drug-related gangs and the weakness of Mexico's institutions. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at that historic sweep in Mexico, and joining us from Mexico City, France 24 correspondent Jan Grillo, author of Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America. Thanks for joining us. From Washington, Pedro da Costa, senior correspondent at Business Insider. Welcome back to the show, Pedro.
Thanks so much.
Photojournalist Ana Lucia Partida is with us here in the studio. She's co-founder of the human rights network Alzalsa Voz. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Now, they're still counting ballots and may do so for quite a while, but initial tallies confirm the landslide win for AMLO, more than half the vote, with possibly absolute majorities in the Senate and Chamber of Deputies for his Morena party and their allies. Now it's all about what he does with that mandate.
Our new national project seeks an authentic democracy. We are not looking to construct a dictatorship, either open or hidden.
An authentic democracy. Ana Lucia Partida, how do you understand that?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's important to look at the history of democracy in Mexico, because we have only really had two parties ruling since we started experimenting with democracy. Since 1929, it's only been el PRI, el Partido Revolucionario Internacional, and el PAN. And really, it's been majority of the time el PRI. So it's something that I think a lot of Mexicans are very hopeful about, is having another party with a different leader, with a different face in our democracy.
Do you believe him when he says we're not looking to construct a dictatorship, either open or hidden?
I do. I feel that we do have to be skeptical, but I think that there is quite a big difference between how people try to compare him to Maduro and how he started changing policies in order to stay in governance for more time, and what he has been trying to aim for, which is just a 6-year presidency and trying to move things forward.
Now, Mexico has a funny system, Jan Grillo, where you don't get sworn in till a long time after Election Day. So all we have to go on is his word. What is his word so far since that historic vote on Sunday?
So he gave this victory speech where you played a part of, and I mean, during the campaign, one criticism has been quite ambiguous about what he's going to do. But some of the things he reiterated in that victory speech there, and also a speech shortly after in the central square of Mexico City, speaking to an enormous crowd, enormous turnout. One thing he mentioned or he reiterated was his social programs. He said he's going to double the old age pension. He's going to, help people out, and that, the people are waiting for more money, and also support for scholarships for kids, apprenticeships, to try and steer people in the right direction. He also mentioned an interesting thing in his victory speech, his first one. He said when he takes power, every morning around 6 a.m., and he's an early riser. He showed when he was mayor of Mexico City, he used to get up very early and have these press conferences at 6 a.m. He said every morning at 6 a.m. he's going to have a cabinet meeting with all of the security officials and oversee that. And he said they're going to be a mando único, a single command. So he has this kind of different thrusts. One is he has this kind of quite pacifistic strain. He's talked about kind of bringing peace to Mexico through amnesties, through bringing the Pope over. And the other is a more statist, more centralized approach. So we'll have to see which one of those kind of wins out or how they combine.
Centralizing the centralizing power, while at the same time, and he's given interviews this Monday, Pedro da Costa, where he talked about reconciliation even with the opposition.
Especially after such a phenomenal win. But being based in Washington, I look at this from a U.S. political lens almost, and I look at U.S. and Mexican relations as really at their worst in modern history. I mean, these countries have taken a long time to build from hostile relations toward a really peaceful coexistence, including NAFTA. And I recall being in Mexico City in past, when I worked for Reuters in past Mexican election cycles, and López Obrador did not garner the votes at the time because there wasn't this wave of sentiment like there is now, which is a counter to Donald Trump.
What did you think of him, Pedro, at the time when, for instance, in 2006, he loses the election, contests it, has a parallel swearing-in ceremony, a bit like the ones Kenyans saw recently with their opposition leader. Did you think at the time he'd someday be the winner?
I wouldn't. Yes, I thought he might, only because, so I'm Brazilian-American, so the PT Lula experience colors my lens a little bit, and I feel like rather than the Maduro-Venezuela comparison, which the American right is seizing on, this morning I turned on my car radio and I was on some right-wing radio saying, look, we have a socialist in Mexico, we need a strong border, we need Donald Trump. That's the argument that they said that Mexico is turning into Venezuela. So I think the Venezuela comparison is terrible, but the Brazil comparison perhaps not so bad because the PT came in with strong popular support, having moderated its policies over several election cycles from the left more to the center. And it governed with a strong social agenda that made a lot of progress, but unfortunately it did so in a deeply corrupt way that has actually tarnished the ability of Latin America's progressive left to get anything done. So it's a real challenge for Amlo, for López Obrador, to be more of a statist now and less of a rebel rouser, as you described him in past cycles.
A statist who wants to centralize things and, as he claims, to be able to stamp out corruption. Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. This one from Evan saying left-wing populist Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador wins the Mexican presidential election partly on a wave of anger at a corrupt political class, but certainly helped by Trump's anti-Mexican rhetoric. Now, turnout was massive. This, we can show you images of a polling station in a library in Mexico City that ran out of ballot papers long before the close of vote on Sunday. There you see people banging on the door. They still want to get in and vote. This after a campaign where fraud and vote buying were once again topical. It's a France 24 report.
It can seem as innocent as handing out a few plastic buckets. Who are you going to vote for?
The Workers' Party.
Because they gave you these gifts?
Yes.
But the message is clear. In turn, you'll vote for our candidate.
We are part of the Workers' Party, and we want you to get your families, your husbands, to support us too.
The NGO Democracy Without Poverty has been tracking every act of vote buying recorded by citizens during the campaign. According to them, a third of voters have been approached by one of the big parties, offering them gifts ranging from food baskets to €500 cash for one or more votes.
En un país con 50 millones de pobres y con In a country where 50 million people are living in poverty, 20 million in extreme poverty, it's a chance to get a bit of cash, a television, a washing machine, a new roof. Those are things they'd never get any other way.
9 million Mexicans are likely to have been part of this fraud. Observers from Democracy Without Poverty have been going around the country collecting evidence and found that sometimes it takes a dark turn. In this village in the south of Mexico, at least 30 municipal employees were fired for refusing to vote for the wife of the current mayor. They were also ordered to help give out solar water heaters to compliant voters.
They outright asked us if we'd support the mayor's wife. Anyone who said no was fired.
It's impossible to know exactly how this kind of corruption affects the election, but there's no question about the damage this does to a democracy.
Ana Lucia Partida, your reaction to that report?
I mean, I feel it's so embedded in, unfortunately, in how elections are. This is nothing new. It's something that we have witnessed in previous elections. I do not think it changes so much the result, because this one was so dramatically the candidates were, but it has led to very contested outcomes in the past.
So it brings us back to what Jan was saying earlier, because here you have a new president who's coming in. He says he's going to centralize things so that there can be less of this corruption, perhaps on the local level. Is that how we should read it? Or what can you do when the institutions are weak, when the people are poor, as we heard in that report? How does Mexico strengthen its institutions?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and he really played on this, fighting the violence in the country and fighting the corruption. But when you think about it, it's so embedded in society and in the institutions that I don't think there's really an easy answer to this. I'm not really sure how he's aiming to work on this, especially when you think about the local level, how many gray areas there are between certain authorities and political figures and local gangs and drug cartels. So it's a quite difficult thing to think about.
Was this campaign the same as all the others you've covered in Mexico?
The same, or maybe even more, in terms of buying votes. Here in Mexico City, there was a big battle between the Morena party of López Obrador and the old PRD party, which he used to be in, and he went away. So they were really fighting, particularly for certain delegations or precincts in the city. And I found very easily testimonies of massive vote buying. I mean, I found a young 18-year-old kid who was given a laptop, a brand new laptop, many people with cards. Now, one of the weird things about this vote buying is there wasn't necessarily an explicit pressure, you have to make the vote. They would give out these things in very shady ways. They would take copies of their electoral details and then expect them to vote when they go in, throwing this kind of money. And that is very sad. See, now, from what you were saying about how will López Obrador stop this, I've been to many of his events in this campaign, and the anti-corruption line is really the heart of his campaign. And I do like his line when he says, Mexicans are not naturally corrupt. This is not part of our culture. It's not part of our DNA. We can stop this. We're a great country. We're a great people. I do. That's a nice line to hear. But how will he really deal with that in the practice? How will he really change that? And it's a nice notion. We'll see if it will work out. If he'll make, will he make exemplary punishments? Will he manage to change the culture somehow?
Will it start with something that you've covered extensively, which is how do you clean up the police force?
Yeah, I mean, so he's talked more about, more centralized, more controlled. That is quite an important issue, because you have massive corruption here. And I mean, if people aren't aware, the level of corruption in police in Mexico is so extraordinary. It's not simply police officers taking bribes. There was a case in Michoacan of a police officer who was friendly with the local reporters, seemed like a nice guy, and then he was arrested. It turned out he was a fully fledged member of the cartel who was decapitating victims and showing young cartel hitmen how to decapitate. So that's some of the public officials you're dealing with. Police officers were involved in disappearing 43 students, possibly burning them on a bonfire. So how do you begin to tackle that? Now, one thing is if you try and centralize it more, now you have these different drug cartels, and there's more than a dozen different drug cartels in the country who hire and control different police forces, different politicians, and they fight against each other. So I've actually covered events where you've had state police or state police fighting federal police or city police fighting federal police. I've actually been there where these shootouts are taking place. So trying to have a centralized control of all this could help perhaps to try and bring these things into line.
What certainly didn't help was what we saw with the previous president, Felipe Calderon, which was this big crackdown on the drug cartels. It didn't stop the drug trade. It just increased the violence at the time. What is his plan when he talks about taking a softer approach?
So yeah, we have to find out what he really means, and I don't think he himself has really got it clear. I think he has this notion, which is not a bad notion in some ways, that this has been a devastating chapter in Mexico's history. Perhaps 120,000 people died in the last 10 years directly as a result of organized crime, or the police and the military fighting them. I mean, mass graves with 250 bodies. I went to one near a housing estate, 250 bodies buried there. When they start unearthing the bodies, the families could smell the rotting flesh. These things have been devastating for the country and for the community. And it is true that some of the young, mostly young men who are recruited into these cartels are victims as well as victimizers. I mean, I've interviewed many of these people. They come from hard areas. They're recruited when they're young teenagers. They commit murders, and they find no way out. So he has kind of a notion, López Obrador, of bringing peace. And I think he has learned that from going around the country, talking to people in communities that he does. However, what does it really mean as a hard policy? What can you really do? Can you forgive people who have committed murder? Can you forgive people who have trafficked drugs, who have kidnapped? That's pretty tough. And even if you bring the Pope Francis to Mexico, what can he do? He can tell people to be good Catholics, but then priests have been saying that for years, and that hasn't really worked.
Alicia Partida, you hail from Tijuana, from Baja. Your reaction?
My reaction, I actually agree with a lot of the things that I'm hearing. I am very skeptical of having change come from this level of change come from a political sphere. I think we have seen massive levels of violence. Tijuana was 2017 was the most violent year we've seen in years, and it's something that is quite hidden. So we don't really hear about it in the news. We don't really talk about it, and I think that is one of the basic steps if we want to change the way our society is how we're living in our society. Is we cannot really wait, even with this change that we're seeing, we cannot wait for change to happen at the political level. I feel like there's a lot of very interesting grassroots community involvement that is challenging a lot of the violence that is happening.
Pedro da Costa, will change be top down or bottom up?
I think it's going to be both. It's always both. He has to have a popular support to effect change, but he has to have the leadership qualities and the vision to move policies forward. And even from this discussion, it doesn't really sound like he made his agenda, or at least his policy path, all that clear. during the, in the run-up to the election. Again, I hate to make it a U.S.-centric discussion, but being based in Washington, I can't help to bring in the chaos that the United States is in politically right now. And the reason I bring that up is because I think it sucks a lot of the oxygen out of major stories like the deaths in Mexico or the chaos, the absolute, chaos in Venezuela, or even the descent into some of the same drug issues that that Mexico is having down in Brazil. And so I think having the United States in political turmoil as it is now makes it a lot more difficult for Mexico and other countries in Latin America to get their houses in order.
Makes it more difficult because what? For instance, there seems to be, how should we put it, frosty relations, first of all, when it comes to issues like immigration and cooperation when it comes to fighting the drug trafficking?
Absolutely, aggressive behavior begets aggressive behavior, at least rhetorically. And for now, you have a U.S. president that's literally talking about Mexicans in, he's describing them as animals and vermin. He's using this language that's normally associated with fascism, and I think it's really dangerous. And there's a risk that that Amlo ramps up the anti-American rhetoric, and that could very easily spiral out of control in ways that we haven't seen. I mean, if the U.S. is having problems with Canada, imagine how quickly relations with Mexico could deteriorate.
Jan Griel, you share that fear?
It's very interesting. When you have President Obama, who had a quite internationalist spirit and came down to Mexico and stood with Peña Nieto and was very internationalist about this and talking about it, and also came down here with Calderon. I saw him at the press conferences there, and he wanted to help and so forth. At the same time, during that period, America's policy when it came to drug cartels was disastrous. America pumped money into the Murder Initiative, which then was giving money and arms and guns and so forth to a Mexican military and security apparatus, which was just fighting cartels but only driving more violence. Actually, and this is an interesting fact that doesn't come out, under Obama, actually more people were deported in the peak years than in some of these years under Trump. There was massive deportations in the first early years of Obama, and that contributed to the violence here. I interviewed and saw a lot of people being deported there and who ended up in drug cartels or in out-of-defense, like self-defense groups. So in some ways, it has to be. So I think this is part of the bigger picture of why we're seeing more nationalist, populist leaders rising up, is that a lot of the kind of liberal internationalism that we have seen in recent years hasn't actually had the results that people want, even if there's been good intentions there. It hasn't solved these problems of violence in these countries. It hasn't necessarily solved these refugee problems. So if Mexico, right now with López Obrador having a more nationalist approach and America having a more nationalist approach, I don't know if that's going to be any worse in terms of dealing with cartels and drug violence than the dysfunctional policy that Washington and Mexico have pursued over the last decade.
Which brings us to the congratulatory tweet that the president-elect of Mexico got from the current occupant of the White House, Donald Trump, saying congratulations on becoming the next president. I look very much forward to working with him. There's much to be done that will benefit both the United States and Mexico! Exclamation point. And one of those things, Pedro da Costa, is they share a healthy skepticism or unhealthy skepticism, depending on how you look at it, of the North American Free Trade Agreement, although not for the same reasons.
That's right. Well, the thing about NAFTA is that you have to look at it in the context of how the U.S. is managing its relationships globally. Because the unraveling of NAFTA that's now becoming increasingly likely with the electoral results in Mexico comes alongside the deterioration, as I mentioned, of U.S. relations with Canada, U.S. relations with Western Europe, U.S. relations with many of its allies, even as the president gets ready to meet with Vladimir Putin. So in that context, I just don't see how a Trump presidency, given that he literally came down that escalator to talk about Mexico sending its worst people, sending its rapists and so on, I think it's impossible with that kind of language, you know, for the U.S. to have any kind of positive, constructive relationship
Has
with
NAFTA
Mexico.
been win-win for Mexico and the United States?
I think not for the workers. It's been win-win for corporations. So it's been win-win for economies, if you will, because there's been GDP growth gotten out of it, but many workers were left out. So there's plenty of reason to complain, but at the same time, unraveling agreements willy-nilly without kind of a plan B is not a good idea either, whatever you think of NAFTA.
Ana Lucia Partida, you agree?
I do agree with Pedro. I'm not I hate to compare Donald Trump and López Obrador, but I do think that one thing they have in common is weak policies. At the end of the day, we're not quite sure exactly where they're going with things. We're not really sure what policies are on the table, and I feel like sometimes they shift, and this is very problematic. I do hold the similar opinion of NAFTA being very beneficial for corporations, but not so much for workers. And it has had a very, very heavy toll in Mexico, with especially in the agricultural sector, where millions of farmers were just, they could not compete. And a lot of them had to migrate to cities, and it had a huge effect on the economy.
A huge effect on the economy. So what do? Do you, in that case, do you rewrite the treaty completely from scratch? Could Donald Trump unwittingly be good for Mexico?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that. I think for years in Mexico, there's been a lot of criticism of NAFTA, and there's been this urge to try to maybe not completely abolish NAFTA, but try to renegotiate, basically. But I'm not quite sure if Donald Trump and López Obrador are the best people to do this, and I think it leaves us with not a very clear idea of what the end result would be.
Jan Grillo, he may be vague in what he says, but maybe if we look around at his entourage, who's whispering in his ear on this? Is it more radical people or more reformers?
He has both within his cabinet, and that's one of the things confusing people talking to them. On this, generally, we're hearing, particularly on the issue of energy, for example, which is really at the core of his politics. I would say even more than the idea of trade. He's very personally embedded in the idea of oil nationalism. He
stopping
really
the privatization,
an expropriation of oil that took place. Yeah, well, he was very embedded personally. He believed growing up from the state of Tabasco, where he grew up, which is an oil state, and the fact that oil was nationalized from British and American companies back in the 1930s, and that was a real benefit to the people who saw that they could have this wealth. And so he was very much against. He launched campaigns against this. He had a heart attack right around the time that the bill was passed to let foreign private companies into the oil sector. Now, on that, people are confused and people are nervous now. They'd have some people saying, "Oh, he's not going to mess around with this. He's going to keep these new open contracts for international business, American companies, British companies that are coming back in." Others that he will look at these. I think on these key economic issues, I think pragmatism will probably win over, at least in the short term. That's my kind of sense. I think from some of the message that he said more recently, from the tone he's taken, but he's saying, I don't want to mess up the cause instability, and I think he will be keen. When you look at his record of Mexico City as mayor, it was generally pragmatic overall. He did work with business in these kind of partnerships. Now, over time, this may change, but I don't think he would do anything like right away, like, which would really threaten large money interests. The other thing is that some of this stuff is working. Some of these partnerships have discovered, they've been doing deep water drilling, and they're discovering a lot of oil down there. And that's billions of dollars. And, why turn that away? And if Mexico doesn't have the technology to reach that oil and foreign companies do, then you might want to work with them to get a part of that money, which could pay for some of his social programs.
Could pay for some of his social programs. Your thoughts on that, Pedro da Costa?
Again, I'm all for social programs, and I think the Lula model is very, up to the point where the PT unraveled as a corrupt institution that was basically running a money laundering scheme. If you do social programs right, then it's wonderful. But if they're rife with corruption, then they're going to be the target of political opposition. And I want to go back to your previous question as to whether Trump could be unwittingly a positive for Mexico, and just remind all of us that there are children being separated from their parents, or at least until recently they were, and they're being held in cages, many of them being shipped around the country. We don't know where they are. So there's no way to argue that Trump is positive for Latin America in any way, shape, or form.
And Mexico's outgoing president had put a lot of the effort at his southern border with his other Central American neighbors when it comes to immigration. Pedro da Costa, the president-elect Amlo, is saying he wants to move the headquarters for immigration to Tijuana. Is he going to make good on that? And what will happen then in the relation between the two leaders?
Well, the thing about immigration, and I think that the thing that we haven't really talked about, is the cause of, the drug wars. And that's drug consumption in the United States and drugs being sold here. So I think that's another reason why the Trump presidency frightens me, is that they're, as bad as the Obama, as our colleague described, the Obama policies were disastrous, but as bad as they were, a more aggressive anti-drug stance that sort of tightens the reins on really basic things like marijuana, as Jeff Sessions is trying to do, sort of a ramped-up drug war just means a worsened drug cartel problem in all of Latin America. And so unless you have some kind of de-escalation of the drug war, you're going to have to continue to have these
even though you've got even though you have, well, Canada that's just announced it's legalizing, many states in the United States which are legalizing marijuana. Are you certain that Trump is going to have his way when it comes to toughening drug policy?
No, absolutely not. I think the wave on marijuana has already kind of tilted the other way. But just generally a more militaristic approach to the border and a more militaristic approach to drug wars in general is just not going to help anyone. And again, the kind of language he's using and the kind of imagery he's using to talk about Latin Americans, we just can't ignore that. And he's seizing people and separating families and literally committing what many people think are international human rights crimes. So I think we really need to keep that in mind in this discussion.
Ana Lucia Pardita, AMLO's campaign promise to move the immigration headquarters where they work on policy to Tijuana. What do you think?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I feel that immigration is something that has been affecting the country for a very long time. The partnership that the U.S. has with Mexico of extending basically the border, it doesn't end, it doesn't start, where you physically see it, but on the southern border with Guatemala. And I think that in a way he was trying to challenge this idea. I do not think it would change very much. I feel that Mexico is extremely militarized with funding from the United States in order to prevent as many people as possible, Central Americans and people coming from many different countries, as well as Mexicans, of course, from trying to get us closer to the U.S. border. So
explain that to us, militarized, explain.
Yeah, well, in a graphic sense, I feel that Mexico is kind of what for migrants trying to get into Europe is the Mediterranean Sea. That is Mexico for so many migrants. You have so many different invisible borders to go through. It's not only local gangs and the drug cartels, it's also authorities, it's also police that are going after you. And sometimes you are an asylum seeker and you don't have the opportunity to request your file to be considered. So there's a lot of human rights violations for people who are trying to find a better life.
And we'll see if Mexico's next president will be able to find another way in dealing with these huge challenges. Ana Lucia Partida, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Pedro da Costa in Washington, Jan Grillo for being with us from Mexico City. Again, condolences, by the way, for the football, what with the loss to Brazil coming up next.
It was expected.
It was expected, okay. World Cup Daily is next with Simon Harding. He'll have more on that.